Skingernalon was seventh night. Somebody knocked on the cabin door. The voice on the other side said, "Boys, it's me. Open up, I'm freezing." The voice was Henrik's, but Henrik was inside the cabin. Henrik was sitting on his bunk. Henrik was looking at the door, and Henrik was holding the small bone he had taken from Aslak in his right hand, and he was shaking. Somebody midnight whisperer. This is part 2 of the Trondheim Huldra account from the winter of 1987. If you have not heard part 1, the link is below this video. Go and watch it, then come back. This will not make sense without it. For everyone else, welcome back. Lights off, headphones on. Tonight, the door opens. When we left Jonas As, he had just been pulled inside the cabin by Aslak Sara. He had looked into the face of the woman in the blue dress. He had seen what was behind her, and outside in the clearing, in the silver moonlight, she was standing very still and watching the door. She did not leave, not all that night, not all the next morning, not all the next afternoon. The 3 men inside the cabin took turns at the gap in the shutter, and every time it was checked, she was in the same place, in the same posture, smiling the same smile. The snow fell around her and did not fall on her. The temperature dropped to -35, and her bare feet did not move. By the second day after Jonas had seen her, all 3 men were beginning to understand the kind of trouble they were in. Henrik was the worst of them. Henrik had aged 10 years in 2 days. The big, competent foreman who had pulled them off the helicopter had become a shaky old man who could not finish a cup of coffee without setting it down to keep his hand from spilling it. Aslak was calmer. Aslak had been raised on the kind of stories that prepare a person for this. He was not unafraid. He was simply not surprised. Jonas was somewhere in between. He had stopped speaking entirely on the second day. He sat on his bunk and stared at the wall, and twice that day Aslak caught him moving toward the door, slowly, dreamily, and had to take him by the shoulders and shake him until his eyes came back into focus. On the second evening, Aslak made Jonas sit at the table. He took the small bone from around his own neck. He held it up. It was, Jonas saw now, a finger bone, a child's finger bone, yellowed with age, worn smooth, carved on one side with a small spiral and on the other with a single straight line. Aslak said, "This belonged to my grandfather. It was given to him by his grandfather. The bone is from a child who died of cold, alone in the forest, in the year my family arrived in Karasjok. Do you understand?" Jonas slowly shook his head. Aslak said, "She is a thing of the forest. The forest takes the lost. The forest gives back sometimes what it is finished with. This bone is a piece of the forest's debt to my family. While I hold it, the forest cannot take me. While Henrik holds it, the forest cannot take Henrik. While you hold it, Jonas, the forest cannot take you. But there is only one bone." Jonas said in a voice that was no longer quite his own, "Then give it to me." Aslak looked at him for a long, long moment. Then he said, "I will give it to Henrik first. Henrik is the oldest. Henrik has earned it. Then to you. Then I will go to the door." Jonas said, "Then she will take you." Aslak said very simply, "I do not think so. But if she does, she does." He took the bone from his neck. He pressed it into Henrik's hand. Henrik, who had not cried in front of another man in 50 years, started to cry, very quietly, his big shoulders shaking under his wool shirt. That was the end of the second day. The third night was the night she sang. It started just after midnight. Jonas was lying in his bunk. He was not asleep, but he was in that strange state between waking and sleep, where the body has gone heavy, but the mind is still listening. Aslak was sitting up at the table, the kerosene lamp turned down to almost nothing, watching the door. Henrik was in his own bunk, on his side, with the bone clutched in both hands against his chest like a child holds a doll. The wind, which had been steady all day, dropped suddenly. The cabin went quiet, and then from the clearing outside, a voice began to sing. It was a woman's voice. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful voice Jonas had ever heard. It was singing a song in Old Norwegian, not the modern bokmål Jonas had grown up with, but the older, harder language of the medieval ballads, the kind of language that you sometimes hear sung at a wedding in a small church in the western fjords by a very old grandmother. Jonas felt his eyes fill with tears. He did not know why. The song was so sad. It was the saddest thing he had ever heard. He understood for the first time what the song meant. The woman in the song had not been a monster. She had only been alone. She had only wanted to keep the man with her. He had been the lucky one. To stay in the hall, to dance forever, to never have to go back out into a world where everything ended. Jonas's foot moved. His leg swung off the bunk. His foot hit the cold wood of the cabin floor. Aslak was already there. Aslak's hand closed on Jonas's shoulder, very gently, and pushed him back down onto the bunk. Aslak leaned in close to Jonas's ear, and he whispered in his own language 3 words. Jonas did not understand them, but the inside of his head, which had been swimming with the song, went suddenly clear, the way the surface of a lake goes clear when the wind stops. The song was still happening, but it was now just a song, a beautiful one, but just a song. Jonas understood then the danger. The song was not for the ear. The song was for the part of the mind that lies underneath language. Aslak had reached down into that part of him and pulled him back out. The song continued for almost 2 hours. The woman in the blue dress, when Aslak finally lifted the shutter to check, had moved closer. She was now perhaps 10 meters from the cabin door. She was no longer smiling. Her mouth was open in the long, perfect O of the song. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were folded across her chest. When the song ended, she opened her eyes, and she looked directly at the gap in the shutter, and she winked. Aslak dropped the shutter and stepped back. Henrik in his bunk was no longer crying. Henrik was no longer making any sound at all. Aslak crossed to him. Henrik was alive. Henrik's eyes were open, but Henrik was not in any way that mattered in the cabin anymore. He had heard the whole song without the bone protecting him, because at some point during the song he had let go of the bone, and the bone had rolled out of his hand and across the floor and was now lying in the dust under the table. Aslak picked it up. He pressed it back into Henrik's palm. He folded Henrik's fingers around it. Henrik's hand fell open again. The bone fell to the bunk. Aslak picked it up a second time. He put it around Jonas's neck. Aslak said, "Henrik is gone. We will keep his body warm. We will not let him outside, but Henrik is gone." That was the end of the third night. The fourth night, Henrik did not eat. He did not drink. He did not move from his bunk except when Aslak lifted him to use the bucket in the corner. His eyes were open. His chest rose and fell, but there was no one there. The woman in the blue dress had moved again. She was now perhaps 4 meters from the cabin door. She was still and silent all day. She did not sing. She did not move. She watched the door. Aslak began that day to make small marks on the inside of the door frame with a piece of charcoal from the stove. He did not explain what they were. They were small, looping symbols, a little like the symbols that had been carved on the bone. He drew them in a line all around the door, top, sides, bottom, and around both of the windows. He drew them on the inside of the chimney. He drew one very carefully on the forehead of Henrik, who did not blink. He did not draw one on Jonas. Jonas asked, "Why not me?" Aslak said, "You have looked at her face. The marks will not hold for you. Only the bone will hold for you. Do not take it off." Jonas slept that night with his hand wrapped around the bone and his other hand wrapped around the wrist of his hand, so that he could not let go of it even in his sleep. He did not dream. The fifth night, Henrik died. It was very quiet. He simply stopped breathing sometime around 3 in the morning. Aslak was sitting beside him, holding his hand. Aslak felt the moment his fingers went slack. Aslak closed Henrik's eyes. He folded Henrik's hands across his chest. He said a small prayer in his own language, very quietly, that he did not translate. Then he stood up and he turned to Jonas and he said, "We have 2 days. The supply will come on the 8th. We must keep her out for 2 more days." He covered Henrik with a blanket. Outside the cabin, the woman in the blue dress, who had been standing 4 meters from the door, took a single step closer.